Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today, we are at Zion National Park, and we sat down with Park Ranger and Vegetation Program Manager Darrin Gobble. We talk all about botany, invasive plant species, and the incredible amount of vegetation that is here at this beautiful national park. Darrin, thanks so much for joining me. I'm excited to do this podcast because we've never talked about plants before on this show before, so I'm excited for you to open up a whole new world to us.
Sure, yeah, excited to talk about plants. Love talking about plants. So.
How long have you been with the National Park Service?
I've been working with the NPS for a little over 10 years.
All focused in botany?
Yeah, for the most part. Most of my job has been working with invasive plant management. It's kind of driven by a love of botany and plants in general. So.
When did your love for botany and plants in general begin?
Man, I was a kid, maybe 10 years old. I grew up in Florida, and lots and lots of plants year round, and you could hike a trail, and seasonally the plants would change. And as a kid growing up in Florida, I remember hiking around asking my dad, what's this? And he's like, oh, fine, here's a book, teach yourself. Became obsessed with plants ever since then. Just kind of, that's driven my life.
We joked off camera about the movie The Martian, and your thoughts on botanists getting some love in a Hollywood film.
Yeah, you don't necessarily get to see that very often, and so now if somebody Googles botany or botanist, or hopefully you get the charismatic picture of Matt Damon on Mars or something. But not a very typical recognition from especially for the national park side. A lot of people come to these parks. They're like, oh, where are the bears? They're like fluffy animals. We have like plush animals that we sell at the visitor center that are pica and birds and stuff, but not necessarily a lot of love for the plants. So it's really cool to see that kind of recognition.
We need a campaign for a plush aloe vera plant or something like that.
Yeah, or like our endangered milkvetch and stuff. I know like maybe 3 people that would love that.
You are the Vegetation Program Manager for Zion National Park. What does that mean? So
I essentially run the whole vegetation program. We focus on restoration of species and then also the management of invasive plant species. And so I kind of like to think of myself as the driver. I'm kind of steering the program. Everybody else in our different divisions, they're the boots on the ground. They do most of the heavy lifting per se. And whereas it's kind of nice to kind of steer them and making sure that we're fulfilling everything that's required of us through protecting those plant species, maintaining this plant biodiversity for generations to come. So.
We are in a library at the Zion Museum of Human History. Behind you set up some botany books.
Yeah.
So I want to take a step back and talk what exactly is botany. For those who are unfamiliar with plants, unfamiliar with what botany is, it entails a whole lot more than just plants. So what is botany?
Sure. So botany is the study of plants in general, but also taking a closer look. It's the study of different species of plants and how we differentiate between those species. So we look at their morphological characteristics, certain phenology types, and we kind of separate those species out based off of those types, but then taking an even closer look, especially with technology nowadays, we can run DNA analysis and sequence that DNA and like really dive deep. And then actually there's so much different with this plant species. So actually you're a whole different variant or a whole different subspecies than previously thought. And so it's this characteristic, or it's a way to like characterize all the different species in an area or the world per se, and in looking at those different subspecies variants and different species altogether and stuff. And if we know the different species, then we know what is out there, what's most at risk. For instance, if there's like a violets are everywhere in North America, but if we have a very specific subspecies or variant or even species of violet that exists only here in Zion and maybe 3 hanging gardens, we know how we can realize how special that plant is and learn to protect it. But without botany, we wouldn't know that that's a separate species by itself.
It's probably a very large question, but you talk about subspecies of even a violet. What are the ingredients that could create a subspecies in a place like Zion?
I love Zion because it's got the 3 major ecoregions, Great Basin, Mojave Desert, Colorado Plateau. That kind of coupled with this vast change of elevation. We've got access to water year round, especially in some of our hanging gardens and seeps. That and the geology, like Navajo sandstone, super special. All of that kind of plays a part in speciating certain plant species and stuff. And Zion's got the most plant biodiversity of any Utah national park, and a lot of that has to do with those kind of main ingredients.
You just mentioned my next question, Zion being the most biodiverse national park in Utah. What does that mean, and what is some of the plants that you could see here in the park?
Certainly. So we have almost 1,100 different species, including subspecies and variants, found here in Zion National Park within our boundaries. And of those 1,100 species, there's nearly 46 endemic species, so species that can only be found here or locally endemic or just outside our park boundary. It's part of what makes it special, but some of the species more commonly seen, down in this lower main canyon, a lot of people are hiking the Paw Roost Trail. They're gonna come, especially this time of year, they're gonna come across our flowering rabbit brush, quail bush, very common along the Paw Roost Trail. And you snake up into the scenic drive, you're going to be met with suddenly, it's 10 degrees cooler there. So the plant community shifts a little bit. We're not as dry and open because of those steep canyon walls, right? So the riparian species, cottonwoods, are iconic, especially this time of year. They're all yellow in their fall foliage. So people really love that. Box elder species growing along the river. We have pinyon juniper kind of in the dry upland area, hackberries. I can go on and on. there's so many plants here. But
in your role, what is your position? How does it maintain these plants and support these plants in the park?
Certainly. So as part of my job, beyond just supervising my staff and making sure they're on track with all of our project work, part of my job is attending a lot of compliance meetings or management meetings where we're making kind of park-wide decisions, and I'm that voice for those plants. So if something were to happen, everybody gets a chair at the table, like wildlife, our physical scientists and stuff, because we're the subject matter experts. And so it's my job to kind of give a voice to those plants. So like that unique violet, if anybody wants to go up there, do a construction project or do anything really, they're gonna have to consult with me before that happens, and I'll give them mitigations, or I'll just be like, no, it's not happening. We need to protect that plant species because that's one of 3 locations that it's in. So
a little off topic, but in a lot of these podcasts, we've talked about how going off trail as a visitor can be really damaging to the environment. Since you are the voice of the plant for these parks, how does that kind of break a piece of your heart when you see that in the park? Yeah,
and so you see it a lot, especially at these parks that get insane amount of visitation, and a lot of people are like, well, just put up a sign, and there's only so many signs we can put up before the whole length of the canyon is just signed or corralled or fenced and stuff, and that kind of impedes the view shed. But mostly, I would love to tell people, stay on the trails. Try not to, you think of, I'm just going to step right here real quick, and I'm only one person, but in a park that sees 4 or 5 million visitors a year, if even just a small fraction of those numbers decide to step in that one area, that area gets denuded, the plants cease to exist in that area, and then oftentimes what we'll find, what plants do move in that area are invasive plants.
Does biological soil crust play a role in Zion?
Yeah, biocrust is super important, especially here in the park. It's very arid here, so the biocrust, it kind of maintains moisture in those areas, prevents erosion, helps stabilize the soil, so a lot of our plants can exist in some of those really harsh environments and kind of nurtures them.
This might be a really easy question for you, or it might be a really hard one, but I find endemic wildlife and endemic plant species fascinating because obviously this is the only place in the world where you can find something that is endemic or unique to this area. How do you determine that something is endemic to this area? How do you know that it only exists here?
So that comes with the science of botany. So the science of understanding our plant species and how they differ from region to region. Like I said, that violet, there's violets all over the world, right? There's woody violets in Hawaii, and then we have violets here in Zion, of which I think there's 6 or 7 species of violets here. Knowing how it differs from plant to plant is how we kind of, that's how we know it's a different species. So a lot of it's looking at the morphological differences. And then if we wanted to dive deeper, we're gonna have to collect tissue samples and run DNA analysis on it.
How does that process work?
A long day of hiking to get to some of these more remote areas, and that's often where we see a lot of our endemic plant species are in these remote areas. They don't see the amount of use that our main canyon gets, or in their protected areas or places that people don't often visit, so sometimes we'll need to hike in. Either it's a long day trip or we might plan a backpacking trip. Certain plant species exist in slot canyons, so we'll need to access those areas through technical means. So we're canyoneering into those places. And then what we'll do is collect tissue samples of plants, record a lot of data associated with that, put it in silica beads, and send it off to our partners at different universities that are interested in studying these plants.
You led me perfectly into my next question, which oftentimes you go into these remote areas of the park. Why does a park like Zion create the perfect laboratory for a botanist to study these plants?
Oh man, there's so many cool things that we have yet to discover here in the park, and simply just by getting to those areas that are hard to reach and hard to get to, we can only then scratch the surface of like what else is out there. I've only been here for about 4 years now, and we've discovered about 17 new species for the park. Not new to science per se, but have never been documented here in the park. And it's simply by just going out there and finding those plants.
This may be one of the questions for you and botanists right now, but has climate played a role in changing the plant species here, or how their survivability has been in an area like this?
Certainly, that's one of our main threats, especially to some of our most sensitive plant species. We've unique hanging gardens here that rely on that water constantly replenishing, and in certain hanging gardens we're fine now, but sometimes that water coming out of the spring is 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. But we have other springs that rely on a much smaller aquifer replenishing cycle, that you could test that water. It's only 40, maybe 60 years old, and so we're already seeing hanging gardens dry up, and we're watching some of these plants become extirpated from these hanging gardens. I'd hate to see what it looks like 40 years down the road when, notably we have less rainfall, less precipitation, so we're finding those aquifers are getting less replenishment. I can only imagine what it's going to look like.
This might seem like an obvious question because it's in the name, but what is a hanging garden?
A hanging garden is, it's where, and oftentimes in Zion, it's where you'll find our two main rock types, kind of where they meet. And so you have the Navajo sandstone, the Kayenta sandstone, and the water will often kind of seep through at that juncture. And sometimes it's on the ground, sometimes it's up high, but you'll see it, and it's where the water's just kind of getting squeezed out of the rocks. And where that water squeezes out of the rocks, you'll find we call it a hanging garden because all the plants are often hanging cliffside, or sometimes it's overhung and whatnot. But you'll find maidenhair fern, Zion shooting star, columbines, and they're all, especially if you come in May, early or mid to late May, it's probably the best time to come see our hanging gardens. But yeah, big, vast, essentially gardens. We think of like a hydroponic setup where all these plants are just hanging down. Really, really beautiful and unique to this area.
When I learned that I was going to get the chance to talk with you, I was at Canyonlands, and I got super excited because at Canyonlands, right as I learned I was going to talk to you, I learned about a community of Douglas fir that exists in Canyonlands at low elevation, and it's a community of Douglas fir that exists in this really odd environment that a Douglas fir wouldn't ordinarily be found. And so I figured you'd be excited about that because you love plants, but I was curious if there's a story like that here at Zion, where there's a community of plants or trees that wouldn't ordinarily exist in this environment, but they do here.
Certainly. So you're speaking about refugia, and so these are areas where it's an old relic ecosystem that used to exist before, before the pioneers came here, before. Even in some instances before mountains were formed, right? And so just like the Doug fir is probably hiding in the north aspect of a lot of those rocks and in small little fragmented ecosystems, we can find that here in some of our hanging gardens. It's definitely not my expertise, so I won't speak too much on it, but it has been hypothesized. So I keep talking about this violet because I've been super stoked about it, and I hiked all day yesterday looking for this violet species, but only found in 3 hanging gardens at very similar elevations. And it's been hypothesized that it's an old relic ecosystem, and it's a refugia from Lake Bonneville. Back in the day, there used to be a huge lake that covered a lot of Utah, and is, of course, obviously no longer here. But you can find these really unique ecosystems kind of at that lake's edge, and kind of paints a picture of what the geology, what the landscape looked way back in the day. And you can see that in those plant communities that are there, those little microhabitats, and then also studying like the non-vascular species like mosses and other bryophytes and lichens even.
Well, first, did you find the violet?
We have found the violet.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah. Previously only known from 3 locations in the park. We found a 4th location yesterday.
Wow, congrats.
Yeah.
How excited were you and your team when you found it?
Pretty excited. I might not show it like emotionally or physically, but yeah, super stoked to find that violet because we know it's not. It's still threatened, certainly, but we need to fully understand its distribution to kind of assess its threat or how threatened it is.
Do plants give us, you just referenced it, and I think the answer is yes, based on your previous answer, but do plants give us a reference of like what Zion used to look like thousands of years ago?
Certainly. Yeah, so like you can see those relic species, hike Emerald Pools Trail later, and as soon as you turn the corner and you're away from any sunlight, you'll see that that kind of what used to be in the main canyon during cooler temperatures and maybe more precip. You can see how pinyon and juniper were lacking recruitment in the lower elevations, but they're creeping up because they're following the temperatures as they go up. You can find pinyon juniper stumps at much lower elevations from time past, and probably the coolest glimpse of the past is in our Chinle area, you can actually find petrified wood. And those come from ancient species of Araucaria that right now they only exist in the southern hemisphere, and it's hypothesized again that they were all wiped out from an asteroid, probably the same asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs.
Wow. What's the relationship in Zion between wildlife and vegetation? What's the ecology like?
Certainly. So geology drives the plants and the vegetation, and the plants and vegetation drive what mammals can exist here. And so whether you're a pollinator or a bat that relies, or deer for that matter, that rely on that on the vegetation for both like eating or gaining nutrients or even a place to live, huge driver for what can exist here. So without our biodiverse plant community and vegetative communities here, we wouldn't see the same mammals or birds or insects for that matter.
Now, moving more into invasive plant species that exist in the park. First, what is an invasive plant?
Invasive plants are plants that either have been introduced either naturally or unnatural means, introduced to an area. They don't have the same, that area doesn't have the same defensive mechanisms against those plants like they would back home where they originated. And so invasive just means moving into an area and something has changed to make that invasive plant more competitive than the other plants that are in the area. You can have native invasive plants. So if you think of sagebrush habitat and the encroachment of pinyon juniper, so those plants are native to those areas, but because we've altered the fire regime in those areas, those pinyon juniper are creeping down to sagebrush habitat, and it's pushing out a threatened or endangered bird species. And then there's non-native invasive plants. So those are the plants that have been introduced. They weren't native to this area, and introduced either naturally or unnaturally.
How can they unnaturally be introduced to the environment?
More oftentimes than not, it's human activity. And so if you think about, you've traveled to how many national parks now?
A good amount.
A good amount, yeah. And I'll ask you, and I love asking this question to visitors I meet out on the trail when they're asking, what are we doing out here? What is an invasive plant? I ask them, when's the last time you cleaned your shoes that you hiked?
That's actually what I was going to get into, because when I was at Arches, they had the boot cleaners right outside the visitor center, and that was another one of my I have to ask Darrin about this when I see him. Yeah. So to answer your question, proudly I say yesterday.
Oh, good, great. But the more common answer to that question is I've never thought about cleaning my shoes. They're just going to be just as dirty tomorrow when I'm on the trail. And so we have inadvertently introduced plants and animals to ecosystems without knowing, without even knowing that we're doing so. So these seeds can travel along in our shoes, in the mud on our vehicles, and even our pets that we bring from recreation place to another area. And then you have a whole network of invasive plants, non-native invasive plants that were brought here purposefully. Maybe road stabilization. We have smooth brome. It's a European grass that was a perennial European grass. It was brought here to help stabilize the road banks, and it also kind of feeds some of the wildlife, but it's a non-native plant. It's starting to encroach in areas like our meadows up high in the higher elevations of the park.
I was going to ask about vehicles. So if you go from one campground at a national park and you travel across the state and come to another campground at a different national park, is that potentially inviting an invasive species?
Certainly. And so ideally, if it was up to me, which most people are probably glad it's not up to me, but ideally you'd be washing any equipment, camping equipment, shoes, vehicles, both before entering a new park and then after entering a new park. Right now, if you'll walk around the main scenic drive, we have a lot of invasive bromes, invasive grasses growing there. Certainly, you don't want to take that seed with you and take it to a new park, maybe back east or something. They don't have that plant yet. And so we want to make sure that we're, taking an approach that, looking at introducing and looking at transporting those plants.
So what is the process like when you discover that an invasive plant might be in the park? What are your next steps after that?
Certainly, yeah. So if we find a new plant species that's not been introduced here, one, we collect a voucher so we can make and that's just collecting a specimen, pressing it, and vouchering it into our herbarium. But we'll kind of collect it just so we know when we found it, where we found it, as like a record for us and other people. And then two, I'll do some research, or whoever will do some research on that plant species. How invasive is it? Does it grow in similar habitats to here, or is it just going to live for one season and die? Because that'll kind of help us triage. We have 167 species of non-native plants here, and obviously we can't go after all of them, so we have to prioritize what we treat here. And so we'll look and see how invasive that plant is. Is it going to cause ecological harm, or is it a risk to something else?
Are there times where you have to go deep into the backcountry to find these or treat these? How long can you and your team potentially be out for?
Yeah, so the thing about plants is they don't necessarily stick to the trails. Some plants are wind pollinated, or they're carried by birds, and so or hikers hiking deep into the backcountry can inadvertently introduce a new species. And so depending on how deep into the backcountry would require us to kind of gear up. We might go out and hike into an area and kind of base camp for 4 days at a time, and we'll base camp. And some of these places, Zion's not very big. You can hike just a day hike in, hike out. But when we're hiking into these areas, we're stopping and looking, all these nooks and crannies. If you ever go hiking with a botanist later, you'll spend 4 hours and you've maybe gone a half mile, because we're stopping and looking at every plant that we walk by. And so sometimes we're backpacking into these areas for 4 days, make a base camp, and do all of our treatments and surveying and inventory there.
So you are the epitome of that phrase, stop and smell the roses?
Yeah, definitely.
What equipment removes these invasive species?
Sure. Yeah, it depends on the plant. So biennial thistles, oftentimes you can just clip their flowering head or their seed head and bag it and hike it out with you. Or if it hasn't gone to seed yet, you could just dig up the rosettes. Either we have pickmatics, shovels, or a nice pair of leather gloves will work. And then some species are highly rhizomatous. So what that means is if we were to just dig up that plant species, most of its biomass exists under the earth. It's not what's visible. And so if we were to just dig up that species, every little piece of root that was left in the soil will turn into a new plant. And so certainly we just go out with shovels, dig up these plants, but then we come back next year and it's 10 times as worse. And so in those cases, we often have to bring herbicide into the backcountry and do a foliar treatment or cut stump, depending on the plant. Species like tamarisk and Russian olive will hike in with handsaws. Sometimes, depending on the sizes of the tree, it could be a chainsaw. Thankfully, now we're at like a level of retreatment that they're much smaller, more manageable, and I know my crew's happy they don't have to backpack in a chainsaw anymore, but certainly not out of the question.
What would Zion look like if you didn't treat invasive species and you let them run their course?
So thinking back to what an invasive plant species is, it came into an area doesn't have those natural defense mechanisms from the ecosystem. So disease, fungus, predation from animals and stuff. And so our job as land managers and our invasive plant crew is to kind of emulate that. They are that they're giving the rest of the ecosystem like a fighting chance to adapt. We know we can't get rid of invasive plants. They're basically here to stay, but our job is to kind of manage it at a level where that plant will inevitably find its niche and exist in hopefully harmony. What happens if we don't provide our native ecosystems that competitive edge is those plants will outcompete most of our native plants. Tamarisk, if you came here back in the early 2000s, over 20 years ago, tamarisk hadn't been treated in the main canyon, and it took over most of all the sides of the riverbank here, which is important habitat for southwest willow flycatcher, other animals and stuff. And if we did nothing to we did nothing to control those invasive plants, they would readily outcompete. And you see that just driving outside of the park. You can see what riparian area in the Southwest looks like when no land manager is either available or willing to kind of put the effort into controlling.
Can climate change and a changing environment introduce a species of plant to this environment? And does it still consider it invasive, or is that now a native species if that's just what the climate is now?
Certainly. I mean, we see plants all the time kind of shifting and changing. And because Zion's got such a drastic elevation, we can see those plant communities kind of creep up the hill, I like to say. So down in St. George, there's a lot of native plant species that exist down there but aren't necessarily found here or aren't established yet in the park. And, talking about combating climate change, we can look at what's called assisted migration. So we can take those plants, those ecological workhorse species that exist kind of at those lower elevations in anticipation of drier, warmer climates and stuff. We can bring those plants to kind of give us, again, a competitive edge as we're watching other plant communities kind of shift and kind of retract into the scenic drive and whatnot. But certainly we find plants naturally that will move up the hill without the assistance of us. We found a mallow species a couple years ago that is very common in the Mojave Desert. It's never been found here in the park, but we found it off the Kolob Terrace Road. Again, really hot and dry in that area. We had a fire back in the early 2000s, and that vegetation community is shifting towards a hot, drier climate because we're not getting as much pinyon juniper recruitment, and without the tree overstory, it's obviously going to be warmer and drier. And so now we're finding that mallow species up in that area.
Earlier we talked about the relationship between wildlife and plants here. Now we talked about the damage that invasive species can cause. So if you pair those two things together, if the native plant species go away, what happens downstream with wildlife and their availability to get food that they've relied on forever? So
they'll get pushed out, and they'll go to those areas that that ecosystem exists in, and they'll look for it. Without a healthy ecosystem, they'll make ends meet. For instance, we have deer here in the main canyon that have run out a decent amount of plants to eat or survive on, and they'll turn to other plants that they don't normally eat. And so last year, the year before last, we've been seeing an increase of deer eating datura, which is I don't know if you're familiar with that plant, but it's in the nightshade family, and there's a lot of alkaloids in it, and it's essentially poisonous, and the deer are inadvertently poisoning themselves, not knowing it, because it's one of the only green things that's thriving in the heat of the summer. It loves the hot, arid ecosystem here, but unfortunately, the deer will move on to other plants that they don't normally eat.
Oftentimes when you're at Zion, you're looking up at these beautiful sandstone cliffs and you feel very small in the world, but why would you encourage people to look down at your feet and what's on the sides of you?
I love asking people that question, or making them take a step back, especially when I lead botany walks for employees or other groups that come up and want to do a plant walk. But I like opening with something very similar, because people come to Zion, they see these vast cliffs, the beautiful cottonwood galleries, the towering trees over you, the towering rocks over you and stuff. And I usually tell people, all right, pause where you're at, don't move your shoes, don't take another step, stop and look what you're standing on. And I want you to try to identify how many different plants are underneath the footprint of your one shoe. And people are mind blown when I ask them to kind of look at that. I feel like, much like our view shed here needs to be protected, but also our biodiversity here. And if we can get people to have that, more of a connection to plants, especially the smallest of plants here, they'll better advocate for their protection.
I feel like you just have to have like the most incredible garden in your backyard. Is this something you practice when you're off the clock too?
I have a community garden that I volunteer at, and then my office is full of plants. But I have a small collection of plants at my house. My background was invasive plants, and so I wouldn't say I have a green thumb necessarily. It was more of a brown or black thumb. I made a living out of killing plants, but all for protecting the native plants. And part of that was identifying all the plants you come across, because you never know what's native versus non-native. And so that appreciation has definitely sparked my interest in collecting all sorts of plant species.
As we wrap this up, we talked about the relationship between animals and plants, but what's the relationship that humans have with plants, and how do plants affect our everyday lives, or how should they at least affect our everyday lives?
Plants, at its most simplest level, provide oxygen for us to breathe, and so without those plants, and then they also supply food for us to eat, or food for other food to eat. And without plants, we wouldn't have these ecosystems. They play a role much like the water in the canyons, the geology, the plants, or the animals, the insects. Every part of it plays a role, and if there's any sort of imbalance, the implication can be far-reaching. I don't think we fully understand the benefits of some of our plants in the world. There could be a pollinator that relies on that plant species, and without that plant species there, maybe that pollinator's going to stop showing up in this area, and maybe there's a lizard that relies on that pollinator as its food source, and you keep working up the chain, eventually it gets to us and can have an impact if we don't properly manage or appreciate these plants.
This conversation has been absolutely fascinating for me to learn about. Do you have any closing thoughts on Zion, the piece that you find in this park, and just a closing thought on how people should look at plants differently now?
I'm always trying to find ways to cure what I like to call plant blindness. And so people often are hiking around these places, appreciating the landscape, but they often take for granted the part of that view shed is the vegetation community. And I would implore people to, next time they go hike your your backyard trail, or maybe it's a county park even in your backyard that you've hiked a million times. Next time, go hike it and stop and look at the plants and what the plants are saying, because those are often indicators of how the ecosystem is doing and how intact it is.
I said that was the closing question, but one very important one for you.
Ask away.
Other than the violet, what's your favorite plant or flower or anything that you can find in this park?
That's the hardest question here. I have a lot of favorite plants, and I'll try to run through them.
Please.
So when I first got here in 2020, became infatuated with our penstemon species, of which we have 17 varieties of. And then over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been obsessed with two of our rarest plant species, violet, which is the Clausen's violet. And then there's a super rare, even more rare than the violet. It's a thistle. And what's so cool about this thistle is it grows in hanging gardens. Only 2 hanging gardens in the park and nowhere else in this world. And so just this year I was able to kind of, again, back in, because it's pretty deep in the wilderness, able to find Cirsium joannae, Joanna's thistle, find it in flower, and yeah. That's what I'm currently obsessed with, at least.
Well, I love it. Thanks so much for this conversation and your time. I think people are going to learn a lot about this, and I'm certainly enthralled by it, and I'm excited to look up a lot of the species that you've mentioned in this park, and I'm excited when I hike through the next few days to maybe see some of the things you mentioned, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. I found that conversation with Darrin to be absolutely fascinating. I learned so much about plants, and I hope you did as well. So if you like this type of content, it would mean a lot to me if you liked, commented, and subscribed wherever you're watching or listening to it from, as it really does help us out. And until next time, safe travels.